I'm getting attacked by a chess piece? Where? Oh, my head? Oh, okay. All right. Man, that was scary. You guys got to tell me I got a knight on my head, man. Shoot. Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. So as you guys know, we don't have any Wesley So going on at the moment. He just got done winning the U.S. championships. But I did go back and I grabbed something from the Champions Chess Tour Finals. Magnus Carlsen versus Wesley So. So as always, for my people that are in the Philippines, I will say Maliki Young Pak Dading Sa my chess, ladies and gentlemen. Mabu hi to you. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Anybody who is coming from Norway, I would say God Morgan and Tusen Tak. Thank you very much for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. But if you guys are ready to go, let's get into the action. All right, so we got B3. You don't see that every day, but it's Magnus Carlsen, and you guys know that Magnus Carlsen, he plays the craziest stuff just to try to make sure that he gets people out of their preparation as quickly as possible. This game is not one of those games, though, because it does go quite a while. It jumps out of theory, then it jumps back into theory. So anyway, rolling through, we do have D5. Usually when somebody, you know, either pushes B3 or G3, can I get the arrows right? B3 or G3 as black, you normally want to respond at least with one central pawn, just to try to blunt, you know, just give yourself a pawn presence. The whole idea of what we call the, you know, the hyper modern school, which is Phi and Ketoing bishops, is to control the center from afar, you know, instead of, you know, controlling it directly with pawns and pieces directly in the center. So competing schools of thought, you know, there's the classical school that thought that you have to have pieces in the middle. And then there was people like, you know, Aaron Nimzovich and Pal Benko, Ben Larson, that came by and said, scratch all that. We're going to go ahead and just put some bishops, you know, all the way on this diagonal. And we're going to play that way. So anyways, we do have bishop to B2. Knight comes to F6. We do have knight to F3. And then we have H6. And we started off with the Nimzovich Larson, as I said before, Nimzovich, right? And Bent Larson. But we have gotten to a ready opening, which is indicative of knight to F3. A lot of times you'll see knight to F3 just starting the game, but it almost always transposes. It's very rare for it not to transpose into something else. So we do have G3. So we have a double Phi and Kettle by Magnus Carlsen. Bishop comes to F5. We see D3. We see C5. Bishop comes to G2. We got knight to C6. Knight to E5, just immediately challenging this knight. You know, if nothing is done, then this knight is just going to take and you're going to double your structure. But it's not too horrible of a situation to have a clump of pawns in the center. But we do see knight takes E5, bishop takes E5. We see E6. Knight comes to D2. And of course, you know, because there's only one knight, we don't have to note which one goes there. We just say knight to D2. Bishop comes to E7. We do have E4, just challenging the presence of these pieces in the center. So the bishop does fall back to G6. We got castles by white, castles by black. We have queen up to E2. Most a logical move, mostly because that's really one of the few squares the queen can actually go to. You know, you don't have the ability to bring them to here, so you really only have here and here. But, you know, it's not blocking this F-pawn. You might want to push the F-pawn at some point in the game. So we do see bishop over to H5, and this is actually a novelty. I can't honestly remember what the other move was that was played, but bishop, I think it was knight to D7, which was played. But bishop to H5 is a brand new move as of a few weeks ago. So we do have the novelty of the game. So we do see F3. Like I said, I mean, you know, you don't really want to block the F pawn. You know, because your pawns are somewhat pointing in this direction, you are going to probably try to get some play over here. You know, free this rook up, stuff like that. I can't draw arrows today. So we do see knight to D7 now. Bishop comes back to B2. And then we do see pawn takes E4, pawn takes E4, and then we do have F5. You know, black is trying to get their own, you know, counterplay going with their own F-pawn push. Something else that you could have actually considered as well, after knight to D7 and bishop came back to B2, it was somewhat positional to actually just go D4. And what your goal with this is just to block this bishop. You know, you're always, whenever you play against somebody who is playing in a hyper modern style, you are trying to shut down their avenues of play as much as possible. So these are moves that you always want to try to be able to play, as long as it doesn't damage your own position, just to try to blunt an opponent's bishop. You know, you always want to put, you know, either pawns in their way or try to make the structure to where their pawns are in their own way. So, you know, it gets kind of complicated when you're talking about structures and, you know, bishops and kind of how the middle game and stuff like that goes. So, but that's what these guys are great at, you know. But anyway, like I said, we did see pawn takes e4, and then we do see f5. We have pawn takes f5, pawn takes f5, rook 8 to d1. It's never a bad idea to put this rook opposite the queen or the king, of course. Bishop does come to f6, and this is like a touch annoying, just simply because this is a really, really nice piece, and you don't necessarily want to trade it off, but you don't have a whole lot of other options. You definitely don't want to put it like on a3. And it's just going to live a horrible existence biting on this pawn after b6. So you kind of have to trade. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and then you now do have knight to c4. And you're just attacking this undefended knight right here, and you are placing this knight on a much better square. It wasn't bad on d2, but, you know, it just has a lot more scope on d2. You know, it controls, you know, and it's just a true octopus, as you guys can see. So we do see rook a to e8. The queen sneaks over to f2. We see rook to e7. And then we have a really nice tempo gaining move of rook to d6. And this is just a really ideal move because you are inconveniencing the queen a little bit. After the queen comes over to c3, you do see rook down to d3. And as you can kind of see, these last couple of moves, you know, black and white have just constantly started to, like, you know, just pick at the opponent's position and any weaknesses that they might have and any undefended pieces that they have. So you see the move, you know, knight to c4 opened up an attack on this rook, on this knight. So the rook swung over, got in the tempo on this queen, and rook swung down to protect. The queen, you know, comes over here, it moves down. So now rook to d3 is attacking it. So that's how these games usually go. You know, you always, because I mean, the opening is not usually a problem for these players. They get out of the opening very well, and then they just start to, like, just look at any weakness or any weak point that the opponent has or any undefended pieces. And that's usually the type of, like, high-level games that happen when you get into, like, a middle game and an in-game scenario. So queen comes back to f6. We do see rook f to d1. Why not double on the file? Knight comes over to e5, and we do see rook back to d6 attacking the queen. The queen does come back, but now we kind of have a little bit of an issue because, you know, we have a possibility of some double trades on c4. So, you know, we need to go ahead and take. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5, and then we do have f4. And f4 might seem kind of weird because you're like, wait, why am I opening up this bishop on my own rook? The point of the situation is black actually has a problem with bishop to d5. If you play bishop to d5, then you are, if you're keeping this rook on this file, which you kind of have to, you're going to have to throw the rook in the way. But you do have, you know, the ability just to capture it here with this rook. So you have a real problem for black. So the best solution to that problem is when you are attacked, you want to usually try to get a counter attack going somewhere else. A lot of the times the opponent, they have some place that you can attack. So the best defense a lot of the times is a counter attack. So the rook does come down to e2, and it is very legitimately attacking this queen on f2, buying a crucial tempo for black. Queen does take on c5. We do see b6. Queen comes down to c3. And now we see a very logical move. We're just going to basically trade rooks here. Rook takes on g2. King takes on g2. Bishop takes on d1. And then we do see rook taking on d1. Yes, okay. So we do see rook over to e8. We see rook to e1. And I mean, I'm gonna kind of run through these moves. We see like quite a bit of like maneuvering and trying to kind of like just better your position a little bit. So we do see queen to d5 with check, and you do have to kind of be careful where you put your king. King comes down to g1. You see rook over to d8. You got a4. You see a5, which generally is a really good move, you know, because you're just kind of freezing these pawns. But the problem is black is actually down a pawn here. So stuff that usually would be really good in a position is not as good because white does have the luxury of having an extra pawn. So we do see king up to f2. King goes to h7. And then true to form, white wants to trade queens. Because as I always tell you guys, when you are up material, if you're trading pieces down, your opponent has less pieces than you. So logically, as you continue to trade down, you're just going to be like getting in a worse and worse position. And the opponent, that extra material is going to start to be very realized. So the queen comes back to f7. We see rook up to e2. The queen comes over to h5, and we're just very logically attacking this piece here. And also, as you notice, these queen moves are constantly making sure that they keep an eye on this f5 pawn, because that is one of the weak pawns in black's position. And at the moment, you know, you definitely can't make some type of move like this, because you're going to be looking at, you know, queen to e7, and you are going to be picking off this rook. So the king side steps over to king to g2. We do see rook down to d5. Queen comes back to e3, attacking this undefended pawn. We do see b5. Pawn takes b5. Rook takes b5. And then we do have queen to f3. As I always said, continuing to try to trade down, because, I mean, you know, it's just going to benefit white if we can get into some type of trade, because as you can see, white does have this passed pawn that can score a touchdown, especially if this rook does get behind it. So we do see queen back to f7. We see rook up to e5, constantly trying to trade. And black kind of obliges in this particular situation. You don't really have a lot of better things to do. You know, you have pawn takes e5. You do see queen down to e6, and then queen comes down to e2. And like I showed you guys before, it's starting to become a lot better for white, because, you know, it's the position is simplifying itself down. So that's kind of what you want to do when you're up material, is try to simplify the position so that there aren't as many tactics, and it's just a lot more simple to try to go ahead and win. So we do see queen over to c6 with check. King comes to f2. We do see king down to g6, and we see h4. You know, we're trying to be a little bit of sneaky, trying to throw a pawn up on h5 and deflect the king, you know, so that we can try to place, you know, some type of you always want to be in a situation where you're trying to put the king and the queen in a certain way to where you can force a trade. So if you can knock the king to a unfavorable square, you can try to see if you can put a check down, especially if the king, you know, comes, the king does come up that way. Yeah. So this would be a situation right here where, you know, you can possibly try to put an attack down. The only thing, the problem with this particular situation, this is something I will mention. If you go and you try to trade actually right now, the problem is something that you have to consider, and it's the square of the pawn. The problem now is that this is not a favorable trade for white, because now your king is too far away from this pawn. And after the queen takes on c4, you have to take back, and now you are looking at a4. So in this particular position, a trade would not benefit you. But if you manage to step your king over just one square, either here or here, then that makes a little bit of a difference, because then you can start to get into the square of this pawn. And then, you know, well, not that one. You would actually come here, and then you can collect the pawn. But as you can see, the white king is one square too far. So these are the little nuances of endgames that you do have to consider when you're thinking about going into trades. Because as you can see, there is nothing holding this pawn back from advancing, because now you have just given black a pass pawn. So you're up a pawn, but you're down positionally. This is not where you want to be. So, you know, you have to be careful in these little small instances. And this is usually how, like, you know, a higher level player will beat a lower level player, or even intermediate level player, because, you know, they're able to calculate and understand more about these types of endgames when everything kind of looks similar. But anyway, continuing to roll on. We do have h5, and because white is up material, this is actually a really good pawn freeze. We do see king down to e6. We see c4. We got a4 trying to break up the pawn structure, but this does kind of give away black's only really, like, positive in the position. You did maybe have some dreams of trying to get that pawn passed like I was showing before. And now after pawn takes a4, there is just no way to really do anything, drum up anything on the king side, because you just have too much defense, and the king is right there. So queen does take a4. We see queen up to d3. And we have a whole bunch of threats here. We have queen to d5. We have queen to d6. So you're just looking at all kinds of nasty. So king does take on e5. You see queen to d5 with check. King comes back to f6. We see queen to d6 with check. King goes to f7. Queen to g6 with check. King goes back to g8. We see king to e6. And then we have king to f8, and then that allows us to collect the pawn right here, right? With queen takes f5 with check. But I actually want to back up. After we saw queen to e6 with check, what happens here if we actually move king to f8 and it's not checkable? Because you guys notice that if you move the king here, it's a check. if you move the king here, it's a check, right? So what happens if the king sidesteps here? So I challenge you guys to go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out what you do in this position to maintain your advantage. Go ahead and do so. Okay, so it's almost the same thing, but you have to actually just add like a tempo in there, and there's a certain way that you have to go about doing it. So this isn't, it's not hard once you understand, but the thing about the situation is it's just a slight difference in the way you do it. So, okay, so let's take a look at it real quick. So you guys notice that after king came to f8, you had queen to f5 with check. The problem in the position is you have to think about the fact that if you leave where you're at to capture this pawn, this queen can just capture. So let's say, for example, like the king goes over and you're like, man, I just really want to get this pawn, and you take the pawn, right? Okay, now the queen can actually take this pawn. So you don't want it to be a situation where you've deserted your pawn, right? So, you know, you notice that if you go king to f8, you do have this check, right? You have king down here. You also have this check. So that's the important thing. So you have to try to create a situation where you have a check that you can put on the king. So then that way you have, you know, you've put the opponent's king in check to where the king has to move, and then you manage to save your pawn. So after you do put queen to e6 with check, if the king does sidestep over to h8, you actually throw a tempo check in first, and then you're able to collect the pawn. So this is what it looks like. You would actually be moving queen to c8 with check first, and this is going to force the king down into the desirable square. So this is kind of like a deflection check. So then after the king sidesteps down to h7, which is the only move, it is now that you actually put the check down. So you actually managed to create the same position just using a different, you know, type of way. So it's kind of like tactical, you know, it's kind of like a little bit of understanding of how, like, you know, to place checks and kind of how to corral a king and stuff like that. So like I said, just going back to look at it, king's sidestepping over, you throw in a deflection check, move the king down, and then you're able to take it, and you're able to maintain checks to force the opponent's king to have to move out of the checks. And then black does not have the time to get this pawn here. And then all you do is just kind of sidestep over, you know, after the king moves to h8 or something like that, and then you can just go ahead and either push the pawn or you can just go ahead and defend it, you know. So it's just a little bit different. So if you guessed queen to c8 with check, then you'd be super gangster. But like I said, we did see queen to e6, king came to f8, and then that just allowed us to collect the pawn. It's kind of one of those things where it was going to happen anyway, because you know Magnus Carlsen was going to find queen to c8 and then taking the pawn. So the king steps over to e8. We see queen to e5 with check. King comes to f7, queen to d5 with check. King comes down to f6. We see king up to f3. So like I said, like I showed you guys before, this is a desirable situation that you've gotten into. Now you have gotten it to where, you know, you cannot capture this pawn, and you are just thoroughly a pawn up, and this is a pass pawn. It's going to be really hard to fight this. The queen comes down to b3 with check. King comes up to g4. We see queen down to a2. Queen goes to f5 with check. King comes to e7. Now we see queen to e4 with check. King comes back to f6, and then we see queen to g6. We still have to hold on to the fact that this pawn is capturable by black. So when you see this scenario right here, you know, we don't want to immediately go to g6 because that's not a check, and that will allow the black king. So this is like, I mean, it takes a lot of thought and understanding of like when and where to place checks to get into this type of scenario. So we do see the queen on e4 with check first. King sidesteps to f6, and then we see queen to g6. And then this is actually the exact position that Wesley So does resign the game. So, I mean, like I always say, I mean, Magnus Carlsen is the world champion. So even though you do want to be the best, I mean, you know, in my minds, you know, in my average player mind, you know, I wouldn't mind getting, you know, just being in a game with Magnus or even with Wesley So. Like, it would be cool. But anyways, just continuing this real quick. I mean, this g7 pawn is going to drop. You know, whether you go king to e5 and allow queen takes g7 with check, or you actually go king to e7 and then you drop g7 with check as well, you are just up two entire pawns. And this is just not an endgame that you can ever win. if you gave this type of an in-game advantage to Wesley or Magnus Carlsen, they're both just driving it home, and that is all she wrote. So I appreciate you guys very much. I'm gonna get off before 20 minutes. I went long this time, but I appreciate you guys very much. Tusen Tak, and I will see y'all next time.